Welcome. In the fading light of the summer of 1939, a dark shadow stretched across Europe. It was a continent haunted by the ghosts of the Great War that had promised to end all wars, yet had only sown the seeds of a more terrible conflict. The ambitions of one man, Adolf Hitler, and the resentful, remilitarized nation he commanded were about to set the world ablaze. September 1939 would become the month that forever marked the end of an uneasy peace and the beginning of humanity's most destructive war. Driven by a fanatical ideology and a burning desire to avenge the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler and his Nazi war machine launched an invasion of Poland. Codenamed Fall Weiss, or Case White, this was not merely a border skirmish. It was the first live demonstration of a terrifying new form of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. But Poland's tragedy was to be compounded. Just over 2 weeks after the first German panzers smashed across its western frontier, the Soviet Red Army, in a cynical pact with its ideological arch-nemesis, surged across Poland's eastern border. The Polish nation, caught in the unforgiving jaws of a Nazi-Soviet vice, was about to be crushed. The participation of these two colossal totalitarian powers would transform the beautiful, proud nation of Poland into a veritable killing field, a landscape of death and desolation. The swift and brutal victory in Poland would not only cement the fearsome reputation of the German Wehrmacht and the Third Reich, but also serve as a deafening alarm bell, a final, terrifying warning that Hitler's Germany had sent to the rest of Europe. The world held its breath. The Second World War had officially begun. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. With his Nazi Party's rise to power, Germany rapidly transformed from a struggling republic into a simmering cauldron of militarism and expansionist fervor, a furnace of war in the heart of Europe. Immediately upon consolidating his authority, Hitler laid out a series of audacious plans fueled by his grand ambition of European domination. Central to his vision was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. This was not just a desire for more territory. It was a deeply ingrained racial ideology that called for eastward expansion to create a vast German empire. This new empire would be built upon the lands of inferior Slavic peoples, and the first and most crucial stepping stone on this path was Poland. Following Poland, his ultimate target was the resource-rich expanse of the Soviet Union. Poland, a nation reborn from the ashes of World War I, was acutely aware of the existential threat posed by its powerful Western neighbor. Its de facto leader, Marshal Józef Pilsudski, a shrewd and battle-hardened statesman, recognized the danger immediately. He initially sought to forge a defensive alliance with France, hoping to create a strong counterweight to German aggression. However, France, paralyzed by its Maginot Line mentality and a deep reluctance to engage in another continental war, proved to be apathetic and unreliable. Unable to depend on the French, Pilsudski made a pragmatic, if risky, pivot. He pursued a policy of delicate neutrality and diplomatic balancing. Deeply concerned that political tensions between Germany and the Soviet Union would inevitably erupt into a war that would tear his country apart, he understood that tiny Poland, geographically trapped between these two behemoths, stood to gain nothing from such a conflict. Abandoning his hopes for a proactive French alliance, Pilsudski's government entered into negotiations with both of its powerful neighbors, aiming to secure Poland's fragile sovereignty through a series of non-aggression pacts. On July 25, 1932, Poland signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Nearly 2 years later, on January 26, 1934, a similar pact was signed with Nazi Germany. This latter agreement was a diplomatic shock across Europe. With this treaty, Poland became the first nation to establish a formal, peaceful alliance with Hitler's regime. It can be argued that Pilsudski's diplomacy was remarkably astute for its time. He consistently and skillfully deflected Hitler's invitations to join a German-Polish alliance aimed at the eventual invasion of the Soviet Union. On his deathbed in 1935, Pilsudski's final instructions to his successor, Josef Beck, were clear. Maintain this delicate policy of neutrality with Germany at all costs. However, the men who succeeded Pilsudski lacked his foresight and his gravitas. Josef Beck, now in control of foreign policy, surrounded himself with aides who harbored a deep-seated, almost pathological hatred of Russia, a sentiment born from their experiences in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919–1921. Under their influence, Poland's foreign policy began to drift away from the careful balance Pilsudski had engineered. It slowly but surely drifted out of the Soviet orbit and tilted dangerously towards Nazi Germany. While no definitive, formal military alliance was ever publicly confirmed, the relationship grew uncomfortably close. In 2019, Russian President Vladimir Putin controversially accused Poland of active collusion with Hitler in the period leading up to the war, stating, "They essentially colluded with Hitler." This is clear from the archival documents. He pointed to evidence that the Polish ambassador to Berlin had even promised to erect a statue of Hitler in Warsaw if he succeeded in his plan to relocate European Jews to Africa. This alignment was further demonstrated in 1938. After the Munich Agreement, where Britain and France infamously appeased Hitler by allowing him to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, Germany provided Poland with tactical advice for its own territorial ambitions. As the Wehrmacht marched in to dismember Czechoslovakia, Poland seized the opportunity to invade and annex the disputed territory of Zaolzie, Teschen, a region it had contested with Czechoslovakia since 1919. In return for Poland's tacit support of his own aggression, Hitler recognized Polish sovereignty over Teschen, a region inhabited by approximately 150,000 Poles and 130,000 Czechs. But this period of cooperation was short-lived. The relationship between Germany and Poland began to sour as the Third Reich's military power and territorial appetite grew unchecked. Germany began to make new, increasingly insistent demands. Hitler was determined to redraw the map, specifically to reconnect East Prussia with the rest of Germany. This German exclave had been separated from the mainland by the Polish Corridor, a strip of land granted to Poland by the Treaty of Versailles to ensure its access to the sea. Furthermore, Hitler demanded control over the free city of Danzig, Gdansk, a historically German port city that had also been put under international administration after World War I. By late 1938, Germany was sending a barrage of requests, which were in reality ultimatums, to Warsaw concerning Danzig. These included a demand to build an extraterritorial rail and motorway link across the Polish corridor, effectively connecting East Prussia to the German heartland. Faced with Germany's enormous and growing ambitions, the Polish government finally understood its perilous situation. It realized that without powerful allies, it would inevitably suffer the same fate as Czechoslovakia. In a desperate search for a security guarantee, Warsaw turned to the Western powers, Britain and France. These were the two nations Hitler considered his most troublesome adversaries, who were attempting to contain the Nazi regime by forming a bloc of alliances with Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Romania. The Polish government's decision to sign a mutual assistance pact with Britain, Germany's long-standing rival, was the final straw for Hitler. Enraged by what he saw as Polish betrayal, he immediately and unilaterally renounced the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact of 1934. In a domino effect, this also led to the collapse of the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement. With Poland now formally allied with Britain and France, the three nations made a belated attempt to bring the Soviet Union into a grand anti-fascist coalition,
But years of deep-seated mutual suspicion and distrust, particularly Poland's staunch refusal to allow Soviet troops on its soil, even for defensive purposes, doomed the negotiations. The talks dragged on without achieving any meaningful results. While these half-hearted negotiations were underway, Moscow was playing a deadly double game. The Soviets were simultaneously engaged in secret talks with Nazi Germany. This culminated in the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a shocking non-aggression treaty that contained a secret protocol. In exchange for Soviet neutrality in the event of a German attack on Poland, Hitler offered Stalin a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. This pact effectively handed over Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Bessarabia to Soviet control, allowing Stalin to reclaim territories lost after the Russian Revolution. With the Soviet Union neutralized and secretly on his side, Hitler was exultant. He could now unleash his military machine on Poland without fear of a two-front war. The path was clear for his Blitzkrieg. The invasion of Poland would be the first step in his quest for world domination, a bloody campaign to erase the shame of World War I and to see the superior German people trample once more over the entirety of Europe and eventually the world.
The relationship between Poland and Russia was poisoned by centuries of conflict, but it reached a new level of toxicity in the 20th century. When Poland regained its independence in 1918, following the collapse of the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires, a chaotic scramble for territory erupted across Eastern Europe. Nearly every newly independent nation waged war to define its borders, and Poland was no exception. Poland fought not only with Germany and Czechoslovakia, but also launched an ambitious campaign eastward against Soviet Russia. The Polish leadership dreamed of re-establishing the historic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a powerful entity that had stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea in the 16th century. Simultaneously, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of Soviet Russia, saw Poland as a geographical barrier, the red bridge over which he had to march to spread the communist revolution to the rest of Europe, particularly to a restive Germany. The Polish invasion of what is now Ukraine and Belarus in 1919 provided Lenin with the perfect pretext. He launched a massive counter-offensive, intending not only to reclaim lost territories, but to crush the nascent Polish state and install a puppet communist government. By 1920, the Red Army had pushed the Poles back to the gates of Warsaw. In what became known as the Miracle on the Vistula, the Polish army, in a stunning and desperate counterattack, shattered the advancing Soviet forces and drove them back eastward. This humiliating defeat created a profound and lasting animosity between the two nations. During Pilsudski's era, the 1934 Non-Aggression Pact with Germany further frayed the already tense relationship with the Soviet Union. But the breaking point came when Pilsudski's successors abandoned neutrality and openly tilted toward Hitler's Germany. The deep-seated Polish distrust of the Soviets was a primary reason why the proposed anti-fascist alliance among Britain, France, Poland, and USSR never materialized. Soviet military campaigns aimed at liberating the ethnic Ukrainian and Belarusian populations in eastern Poland had repeatedly failed. This history of failure, combined with the West's appeasement of Hitler and Poland's hostility, pushed Stalin toward his cynical pact with Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a masterstroke of cold, calculated realpolitik. It not only kept the Soviet Union out of an immediate war, but it also allowed it to achieve its long-held territorial ambitions. This pact sealed Poland's fate, officially marking it as the first target for Hitler and his Nazi war machine in their vengeful crusade. With the Soviet pact secured, the highest echelons of the German military command worked feverishly to finalize their invasion plan. Hundreds of strategies were proposed and debated by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. The initial plan, a more conventional strategy focused on encirclement, was discarded in favor of a revolutionary and audacious new concept, Fallweis, or Case White. This plan was not the brainchild of a seasoned general, but of a lesser-known but brilliant staff officer. When this officer presented his plan, Chancellor Hitler, known for his constant interruptions and amendments, sat and listened with the rapt attention of a student, offering not a single objection. This was an unprecedented event during his reign. That brilliant, then anonymous officer was none other than Erich von Manstein, who would go on to become one of Germany's greatest field marshals. Manstein's Case White was the blueprint for the Blitzkrieg. It was designed for maximum speed, shock, and disruption. The plan called for two massive army groups, Army Group North and Army Group South, to strike from three directions: north from Prussia, west from the German mainland, and south from Silesia and newly acquired Slovakia. The core of the assault would be powerful armored spearheads, the Panzer divisions, which would punch through the thin Polish defenses, bypass strongpoints, and drive deep into the enemy's rear, aiming directly for the capital, Warsaw. Simultaneously, the legendary Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, would unleash hell from above, tasked with obliterating the Polish air force on the ground, shattering communication lines, bombing transportation hubs, and terrorizing civilian populations to induce a state of national paralysis. Poland's geography was tragically perfect for such a strategy. Its long, flat plains offered ideal tank country, provided the weather held. The country was saddled with an incredibly long border to defend, nearly 3,500 miles or 5,600 kilometers, which had been extended by another 1,250 miles or 2,000 kilometers with East Prussia and another 185 miles or 300 kilometers after Germany's annexation of parts of Czechoslovakia. This immense frontier forced the Polish army to spread its forces thinly, creating a brittle and easily penetrable defensive line. Germany's overwhelming superiority in numbers, technology, and modern military doctrine made a lightning war not just possible, but inevitable. Poland was to be the proving ground, the live-fire experiment for the very tactics that would later allow Germany to conquer most of Europe in a matter of months. The scale of the German deployment was staggering. Over 1.5 million troops organized into 60 divisions and 6 brigades. More than 2,700 Panzers, including modern Panzer IIIs and IVs, organized into devastating armored divisions. A formidable air fleet comprising 1,180 modern fighter aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109, 290 terrifying U-87 Stuka dive bombers, 1,100 medium and heavy bombers, and over 800 transport and reconnaissance aircraft. This was a force designed not just for victory, but for annihilation.
Caught between two ruthless superpowers, Poland understood it could be devoured at any moment. With the promise of aid from Britain and France, the Polish High Command developed Plan West. Their primary defensive strategy was to establish a long line of defense along the German-Polish border. The industrial heartland of Silesia, in southern Poland, was deemed a critical asset that had to be defended at all costs to ensure a steady supply of equipment for a prolonged war. The Polish plan was tragically flawed. It was predicated on a series of fatal miscalculations. Firstly, the Polish leadership, whose military doctrine was still rooted in the trench warfare of World War I, believed that any German invasion would be a conventional, slow-moving affair dominated by infantry and artillery. Consequently, they constructed a network of shallow trenches and fortifications, believing they could bog down the German army long enough for their allies, Britain and France, to launch a massive offensive on Germany's western front, forcing Hitler to divert his forces. Secondly, and most fatally, their plan rested entirely on the assumption that Britain and France would honor their commitments and attack Germany within days of the invasion. This belief led them to deploy the bulk of their forces along the western border in an attempt to hold as much territory as possible, rather than establishing a more defensible line further east along major rivers. This forward deployment played directly into Germany's hands, making the Polish armies vulnerable to swift encirclement. The Polish military itself was a paradox. It was large, and its soldiers were brave and patriotic, but it was technologically and strategically a generation behind the Wehrmacht. It lacked sufficient anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft artillery, and modern aircraft. Its reliance on infantry and cavalry brigades, while courageous, was no match for the mechanized fury of the Panzers and the terror of the Stukas. On the Soviet side, despite the non-aggression pact, Moscow was preparing for war. Stalin was determined to reclaim the territories of western Ukraine and western Belarus, which he considered rightfully Russian lands lost to Poland in 1921. The Red Army mobilized two massive army groups designated as fronts, the Belarusian Front and the Ukrainian Front. This force consisted of a mix of cavalry and mechanized units, totaling over 800,000 troops, 4,736 tanks, 3,300 aircraft, and nearly 5,000 artillery pieces. The Soviet plan was simple and brutal. Wait for the German army to engage and exhaust the Polish forces in the west, and then, at the opportune moment, pour across the eastern border to seize their designated prize with minimal resistance. Poland was about to be stabbed in the back.
The pretext for war came on the night of August 31, 1939. Under the codename Operation Himmler, SS commandos dressed in Polish army uniforms staged a phony attack on a German radio station in Gleiwitz, a town on the border. They broadcast a short anti-German message in Polish, left behind the bodies of concentration camp prisoners dressed in German uniforms, and vanished into the night. Hitler now had his casus belli. He declared that Poland had committed an act of unprovoked aggression against the Third Reich. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, the invasion began. The first bombs fell on the small town of Wielun, a target with no military significance, killing 1,200 civilians in a pure act of terror. Simultaneously, in the Baltic, the ancient German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had been on a goodwill visit to Danzig, opened fire with its massive guns on the Polish military depot at Westerplatte. Then the land invasion began. From the north, east, and west, 56 German divisions surged across the border. The Blitzkrieg was unleashed. The Polish army, strung out along the frontier, was shattered by the concentrated force of the German armored spearheads. The Luftwaffe quickly established total air supremacy, destroying the Polish Air Force on the ground and relentlessly bombing roads, bridges, and railways, creating chaos and preventing Polish units from mobilizing or repositioning. The world watched in horror. True to their word, Britain and France delivered an ultimatum to Germany. When it expired without a response, they declared war on September 3. They were followed by declarations from across the British Empire, including India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada. But these declarations were hollow. The French and British governments, still clinging to a policy of appeasement, declared war but did not wage it. This period became known as the Phony War. Along the Franco-German border, the combined Allied forces vastly outnumbered the skeletal German divisions left to man the Siegfried Line. A determined French offensive could have punched through and threatened the German industrial heartland, potentially saving Poland. The French army did advance a few miles into German territory in the Saar region, but the Allied War Council immediately ordered a halt and then a full withdrawal. French soldiers were ordered to stay at least 1 kilometer from German positions. To pass the time, British and French troops engaged in recreational activities. The French premier even distributed 10,000 soccer balls to his soldiers. While Allied soldiers played soccer, Poland burned. Deceitfully, the French government informed the Poles that a major bloody clash had forced the Germans to withdraw 6 divisions from Poland to face them in the west. It was a cruel lie. This betrayal by its allies utterly destroyed Poland's entire defensive strategy.
Even without Allied help, the Polish army fought with ferocious bravery. But courage was not enough. Their outdated tactics were no match for the German war machine. In the south, near Warsaw, during the Battle of Tomaszów-Lubelski, the sheer superiority of German combined arms tactics was on full display. In just 5 days, German panzers and infantry annihilated 2 Polish infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade, killing 10,000 Polish soldiers for the loss of only 850 Germans. The Polish corridor was severed, linking East Prussia to the rest of Germany. Above, the sky belonged to the Stukas. Their terrifying sirens, the Jericho trumpets, became the soundtrack to Poland's destruction as they dive-bombed military and civilian targets with impunity. Within a week, German spearheads had penetrated 140 miles or 225 kilometers into Poland and were already on the outskirts of Warsaw. The capital itself came under relentless bombardment starting on September 9. As German forces prepared to encircle and lay siege to Warsaw, the Polish army attempted its largest and most desperate counteroffensive of the campaign, the Battle of the Bzura. Polish forces retreating from the border region launched a surprise attack on the exposed northern flank of the German 8th Army. Initially, the attack was successful, throwing the Germans into disarray and winning some of the first Allied tactical victories of the war. But once again, German technological and operational superiority proved decisive. The Luftwaffe was called in. In an overwhelming display of air power, German bombers systematically destroyed the bridges over the Bzura River, trapping the Polish forces. The encircled Poles were then subjected to a relentless aerial bombardment. Day after day, bombs rained down on them. Those who survived the air raids were easily captured or killed by the tightening German ground forces. In this one battle, the Luftwaffe dropped over 388 tons of bombs. By the time it was over, 225,000 Polish soldiers had been killed or captured. Every major Polish attempt to counterattack had been broken. With the defeat at the Bzura, Warsaw's fate was sealed. The Polish government, facing the complete collapse of its military, was forced to flee the capital, relocating to the southeast to prepare for an eventual evacuation to neighboring Romania.
From the first day of the invasion, Hitler had been pressuring Stalin to uphold his end of their secret bargain. Stalin, ever cautious, waited. He wanted to ensure the Polish state was on the verge of total collapse before he made his move. The crushing German victory at the Bzura was the signal he had been waiting for. On September 17, 1939, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east. The Soviet invasion was presented to the world not as an act of aggression, but as a humanitarian intervention. The Soviet Foreign Ministry declared that the Polish state had ceased to exist, and therefore all treaties between the USSR and Poland were void. Moscow announced that its troops were entering Poland solely to protect its Ukrainian and Belarusian blood brothers who had been abandoned to their fate by the collapsing Polish government. It was a transparently cynical justification for a brutal land grab. The more than 800,000 soldiers of the Red Army poured across the border, organized into the Belarusian and Ukrainian fronts. Although the Polish High Command had anticipated a potential Soviet betrayal, the speed and scale of the German victory had left them with no time to prepare. The only forces defending the eastern border were a paltry 20 border protection battalions, a force as insignificant as a single ant before a tidal wave. The Polish command issued a desperate order to its troops: do not engage the Red Army unless attacked first. But in many places, outnumbered and isolated Polish commanders had no choice but to fight. The results were predictably one-sided and bloody defeats. As the Red Army advanced, the Soviets also incited and armed local nationalist and communist groups to rise up against the Polish authorities, further hastening the country's collapse. In many towns and villages with large Ukrainian or Belarusian populations, the advancing Soviet troops were welcomed as liberators, come to free them from Polish rule and reunite them with the Soviet motherland. This second invasion from the east was the final, fatal blow. The Polish government, now understanding that the war was irrevocably lost, refused to surrender or negotiate a peace treaty with Germany. Instead, they issued one last order to all remaining military units: evacuate Poland and regroup in France to continue the fight. With Soviet assistance, the German army quickly mopped up the last pockets of resistance. Within the final week of September, Poland was entirely under German and Soviet control. A triumphant Hitler gave a speech in the captured city of Danzig, proclaiming, "Poland will never rise again in the form of the Versailles Treaty. That is guaranteed not only by Germany, but also by Russia." The German victory in the opening campaign of World War II was absolute. With the Polish army utterly defeated, the nation's territory was carved up by Germany, the Soviet Union, and their allies, Lithuania and Slovakia. On September 28, 1939, in Moscow, German and Soviet officials signed the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty. This treaty formalized the partition. The eastern part of Poland, an area of about 77,000 square miles, 200,000 square kilometers, largely the territories Poland had annexed from Russia in 1921, was officially incorporated into the Soviet Union. Western Ukraine and Western Belarus were absorbed into their respective Soviet Socialist republics. Further agreements were made solidifying the spheres of influence in Lithuania and other Baltic states. But this friendship between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was nothing more than a temporary, pragmatic alliance of predators feasting on a shared kill. Despite the new border drawn along the Bug River, the ideological fire of war between them never ceased to burn. It was only a matter of time before Hitler would turn his sights on his erstwhile partner, a plan that would culminate in the cataclysmic Operation Barbarossa less than 2 years later. For Poland, the cost of this month-long war was catastrophic. Over 60,000 Polish soldiers had been killed, and hundreds of thousands more were now prisoners of war in German and Soviet camps. The country was devastated, particularly its cities, which had been subjected to indiscriminate German air raids. The invasion of Poland was the official opening act of World War II in Europe. The speed and efficiency of the German victory stunned the world. In less than a month, the Wehrmacht had crushed a nation whose army was considered the fifth largest in Europe. The press and military analysts globally were in awe of the swift, decisive triumph of the Third Reich. However, behind closed doors, the German High Command was not entirely satisfied. They identified numerous logistical and coordination flaws in the Polish campaign. They knew that to face the far more powerful armies of Britain and France, the Wehrmacht would need to be even more ruthlessly efficient. They immediately initiated a program of intensive training and tactical refinement, correcting the mistakes made in Poland. The Blitzkrieg was being perfected. The German army, brimming with confidence and an aura of invincibility, now stood ready to unleash its fury upon France and the rest of Western Europe. The fall of Poland in 1939 stands as one of history's great tragedies. A story of a proud nation crushed between two of the most brutal totalitarian regimes ever known. It was a campaign defined by revolutionary military tactics, cynical political maneuvering, heroic but doomed resistance, and ultimately, the heartbreaking betrayal by allies who had promised protection but offered only empty words. The Polish campaign was more than just the first battle of the Second World War. It was the crucible in which the horrors of the coming years were forged. It demonstrated to the world the terrible power of mechanized warfare and the utter ruthlessness of its perpetrators. The lessons learned in the rubble, Warsaw, and on the blood-soaked plains of Poland would shape the devastating conflict that was to follow, a war that would consume the globe and change the course of human history forever.